Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Ewalt, the Senior Director of Events and Live Journalism for the Texas Tribune. Welcome to those joining us here in person in Houston and those joining us online for our program titled Texas and the Race to Provide the World's Clean Energy. Texas is known across the world as a top energy producer primarily because of the state's massive oil and gas industry. But as we continue to face the impacts of climate change, some in the state are pushing for Texas to be a national leader in the clean energy movement as well. Hydrogen initiatives are drawing interest, so is geothermal power. Companies large and small are working to figure out the next best thing when it comes to energy. Will these efforts help to secure Texas's future as an energy and economic leader? Today's program is for all Texans interested in the topic, whether you're an industry expert or simply curious about the future of what may power our communities. And we'll begin the program with a quick overview of the technology itself before our conversation continues. We are joined this afternoon by Robert Bullard, Executive Director of the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at Texas Southern University, Sarah Jewett, Vice President of Strategy at Fervo Energy, and Brett Perlman, CEO of the Center for Houston's Future. The program is moderated by my colleague, Emily Foxhall, climate reporter for the Tribune. Our program will run a little over an hour with 55 minutes or so for conversation, especially since we talk a little about the technology itself, and then 15 minutes or so for your questions. Here in Houston, we have mics for our in-person audience, and our virtual audience can also submit questions online at our Q&A portal, texastribune.org/ask. We are grateful for the support of our sponsors. Our major sponsor for today's event is Ally Energy. Our foundation sponsors are the Energy Foundation and the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. Though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite this event, they play no role in determining the content, speakers, or line of questioning. And on behalf of my Tribune colleagues, I also want to thank all of those throughout the state of Texas who support the impactful journalism of the Tribune, including those who have become members. To learn more and to become a member, visit texastribune.org/support. And finally, we want to thank the folks at EDP Renewables for hosting us today. We have a number of upcoming Tribune events around the state, including one on art and democracy in Texas, being held April 10th in El Paso and online, as part of our We the Texans project focused on democracy in Texas. That's followed by a full-day symposium in El Paso on April 11th, titled What the Rest of Texas Can Learn from El Paso. And in Austin on April 20th, we partner with UT Austin's OBJ Urban Lab on the future of Texas downtowns. Who are downtowns for? You can learn more about these events at texastribune.org/events. Now let's get to know our panel. Robert D. Bullard is Distinguished Professor of Urban Planning and Environmental Policy and Founding Director of the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at Texas Southern University. He is co-founder of the HBCU Climate Change Consortium and the National Black Environmental Justice Network. Often called the father of environmental justice, he is the author of 18 books, including his latest, The Wrong Complexion for Protection: How the Government Response to Disaster Endangers African American Communities. Sarah Jewett is Fervo Energy's Vice President of Strategy. In this role, she runs multiple corporate functions, including corporate strategy, policy and regulatory engagement, external affairs, people operations, and future business lines. Prior to joining Fervo, she worked in corporate development and strategic initiatives for Select Energy Services, and she started her career in the oil field, running hydraulic fracturing crews across the western United States and Alaska for Schlumberger. Brett Perlman serves as the CEO of the Center for Houston's Future, a nonprofit organization working to address matters of highest importance to the long-term future of the greater Houston region. His career has spanned senior positions in business, government, and community service organizations. His career Perlman served for 4 years as a commissioner on the Public Utility Commission of Texas, where he was appointed in 1999 by then-Governor George W. Bush. And our moderator today, Emily Foxhall, is the Texas Tribune's climate reporter. She joined the Tribune as an energy reporter in December 2022, focused on the state's transition to green energy, the reliability of the power grid, and the environmental impact of electricity generation. Emily is based here in Houston, where she grew up. Leading up to today's event, Emily's published a series of stories this week focused on hydrogen, geothermal, and small nuclear reactors. I encourage you to visit texastribune.org to read them. I thank our panel and our audience for being here in Houston and online. And with that, I turn the program over to Emily.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks. It's so great to see everybody in the room, and I hope you're as excited as I am about this amazing group of people we're going to hear from today. These have been really fascinating technologies for me to learn about. So like Matt said, even if you're familiar with them or not, I hope this discussion is useful and engaging for you. So we're going to start with a quick 5-minute-ish overview from each of our panelists about the technologies and their work. And we'll start that with Brett, who is going to tell us a bit about hydrogen.
Well, thanks, Emily, and thanks to Texas Tribune for inviting me to be part of this exciting panel. And I just want to tell you how honored I am to be on a panel with two pioneers in their own right. Dr. Bullard is really the pioneer of environmental justice and has really had a major influence on all of our thinking about the energy and the energy future. And Sarah's company is a pioneer in another way, a pioneer in technology, and very anxious to hear what you have to say. So I'm really pleased to be with you all and with the audience too, to hear and from you on what you all are thinking about our energy future. So I thought I'd start out just by giving a little bit of background. Last week, as many of you know, was the Sierra Week conference here in Houston. And as part of that conference, which attracts many luminaries, Bill Gates was here, and he came to Texas because he wanted to see the future of energy, because he believes that the Lone Star State is showing the world how to power a cleaner tomorrow. I had the chance to meet with Mr. Gates to talk about clean hydrogen's role in the energy future. And I told him that if he really wanted to understand the future of energy in Texas and the role that hydrogen might play, he needed to look to the past. Because in my lifetime, I've seen 3 energy revolutions. The first revolution was the shale revolution, which transformed Texas from a declining oil and gas producer to a world leader in oil and gas production. As recently as 2008, volumes of oil and gas production had declined to less than 1 million barrels a day after 4 decades of steady decline. But following the shale revolution, we've had a 15-year run of interrupted growth averaging 14% a year, reaching over 6 million barrels per day this year. This remains an important energy engine for our economy and a cornerstone of the clean hydrogen revolution, as I'll explain. The second revolution was renewables. And this has transformed Texas into the Saudi Arabia of wind and solar. And when I was on the Public Utility Commission, I had something to do with that, and at least setting the framework, although I will confess that I didn't see that bright future. And that's one of the reasons I didn't want to miss this one in hydrogen. Today, Texas leads the nation in wind, solar, and energy storage. We have over 40 gigawatts of wind and 12 gigawatts of solar, and we're building 6 gigawatts of batteries. And just to make those numbers meaningful, they are quite meaningful when you realize that we set a record recently where over 70% of the energy on our grid came from wind and solar power. This is both decarbonizing our grid and lowering costs. And I believe that these 2 revolutions will set us up for the development of clean hydrogen, which will be the next energy revolution. Now, hydrogen's kind of a techie thing. It's the first element on the periodic table, so you might ask, why hydrogen? Well, hydrogen is a light element, but it packs a punch in terms of energy density. In fact, Bill Gates calls it the Swiss Army knife of the energy transition because of its potential to substitute for existing fuels in a wide variety of energy applications, from shipping to transportation and aviation. It's also a key ingredient to create ammonia for fertilizer, which is central to farming and the green revolution, and which can be exported around the globe. We produce hydrogen today on the Gulf Coast by transforming natural gas And in the future, we can make it clean by capturing the carbon. But we can also create hydrogen by taking renewable energy and splitting hydrogen, water, into hydrogen and oxygen. And as it turns out, Texas is a really good place to do this. We have a large existing pipeline capacity network, 1,600 miles of pipelines. That's about 50% of the dedicated hydrogen pipeline capacity. We have end-use customers who use hydrogen today in refining and petrochemicals and will need to reduce their carbon emissions. And we'll see other applications in things like trucking and shipping going forward. We have a lot of storage potential. We can store hydrogen underground and use it as a big battery. In fact, we already have 3 of the 6 storage caverns in the world located on the Gulf Coast. And we also have unmatched onshore and offshore storage to lock away that CO2 for decades. We have an industry that knows how to manage hydrogen safely. And as I mentioned, we have cheap and plentiful feedstocks of natural gas and renewable energy, which will be key to producing hydrogen. So that's the reason I believe that hydrogen can make us green, not only in decarbonizing our energy sector and showing the rest of the world how it can be done, but it can also bring jobs and economic growth to our economy. And as I'm sure we'll discuss, I believe this growth can transform all sectors of our economy and can be done in a just, inclusive way. So thank you for letting me be part of this panel and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Brett. You took something very complicated and gave us a good hydrogen 101, so appreciate that.
Sure.
Sarah, we'll go to you next to talk about geothermal.
Sure. Thank you, Emily. Very well done, Brett. I'll try to be quite as polished as you. I also would encourage all of you, I imagine if you are here, you have probably read Emily's 3-part series that she just produced on energy in the Texas Tribune. I thought it was fantastically well done. We get covered a lot, and I just think that the quality of Emily's reporting was super solid. So thank you actually for covering your 3-part series. I thought it was really good. I'm extra nervous today because my mom's in the audience. So if you sense some nerves, I've got to get them out because she's here. My name is Sarah Jewett. I'm the Vice President of Strategy for Fervo Energy, a Houston-based geothermal energy startup or company. Who's to say? We're trying to figure out now whether we've crossed the Rubicon to company from startup. I'm going to tell you a little bit about geothermal as a whole because I'm sure most of my answers to Emily's questions will focus on Fervo perspectives. But the geothermal energy industry is not a new industry. Actually, hydrogen is also not a new industry. So here we are on sort of, take 2 or 3 of these old industries. And geothermal's been around since the first direct-use heating system was installed in Boise, Idaho in 1890. And then the first geothermal large-scale power facilities were built in the 1950s and 60s in the state of California. So a lot of people scratch their heads when geothermal comes back into the conversation now and they say, okay, why are we talking about geothermal again? It's never really been a big part of our energy discussion. So why is it now all of a sudden? And I think one of the best ways to explain that is to look to the market and to look to technology development. So from a market perspective, I don't know if you all are sort of as, electricity load wonks as the rest of us, but the electricity load is being rumored to increase at a pretty massive rate right now. We're electrifying a huge number of things, including vehicles, home appliances, things that you all are familiar with. We are also onshoring a lot of manufacturing. We're building data centers for AI. We're doing a lot of things that are, for the first time in a while, really causing projections of energy demand to sort of fly off the chart. And we're not sure how much it's going to fly off the chart. But it's a really interesting concept. Today, we are, a huge producer of oil and gas. We actually have a really robust clean energy economy. But when you look at load forecasts and load demand growth, you sort of think, okay, how are we going to cover this load, especially at a time when we are trying to decarbonize our energy sector? And so one of the interesting things that leads you to is we're looking for reliable power that can be always on, that sort of has a fossil energy profile, but that is clean. And then the third leg of the stool is affordable, and I'm sure we'll talk about that too. But you want power that is affordable, power that is always on, that allows you to charge your phone when you need it and do what you need to do when you want to do it. And also, it's clean. So for the longest time when we've thought about clean energy, we've thought about it sort of as a supplement to our fossil fuel base. Fossil fuels produce all the time. Clean energy is going to come on as sort of an adder to that. I think what we're seeing now is utilities, corporations, the federal government, everyone wants to build a much larger part of their portfolio that's actually just clean. And so they're needing more of that reliable baseload to be clean. So there's been a really big spotlight shined on 24/7 carbon-free energy that can be fielded by nuclear energy, some biomass, hydropower at times when you're not in extreme drought, and geothermal energy. So there's been renewed focus on geothermal power for that reason. And then at the same time, something happened that was led by Texas called the shale revolution. We're trying to access energy that exists below the surface of the earth. It's not quite as easy as wind and solar where you can observe the conditions that you're trying to build a project in. You actually have to drill into the earth to understand what temperature looks like, what rocks look like, things like that. And so the shale revolution is hugely meaningful to the ability of geothermal energy to proliferate in many different types of ways. There's just a massive amount of technology that didn't exist in the 1950s and 60s when the first projects started to come on. So geothermal has kind of been this historically really niche industry with very specific use cases that now all of a sudden has a much broader use case because we have all of this technology developed by, in large part by Texans. I like to think it was all Texans. That we can deploy to extract heat from the earth. So I'm representing the geothermal power industry. That means we are drilling into the earth, we're extracting heat, we're generating electricity with that heat, and then we're putting it on the power grid to serve load. There are other types of geothermal energy. You can use the heat directly. You can actually co-locate, say, a direct air carbon capture plant that needs heat in order to eject carbon from its filters. You can actually locate that directly next to a geothermal facility and use the heat directly. And then there's also geothermal for residential heating and cooling. And so when I answer Emily's questions, I'll be talking about the sort of grid-connected utility scale power part of the industry.
It was so interesting to me to think about geothermal because I even date it back to ancient times, like these natural hot springs or hot pools that people have been using to relax in. Maybe you've gotten to do that on a trip or cook with. Yeah, right. And so one distinction I do want to add is what these new geothermal companies are doing is finding a way to get the heat out of the earth, even where there is no water or steam, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so that's new and shiny. Okay, and Dr. Bullard, if you can root us in the environmental justice discussion here and give us an overview from your perspective.
Well, thanks a lot. And I want to thank Texas Tribune for holding this forum. My name is Robert Bullard. I'm a sociologist. And I'm an environmentalist. I have been working for more than 4 decades on the intersection of issues around environment, policy, and justice. I've written 18 books over the last 40 years, covering a range of issues from health, environment, climate, energy, disaster, transportation, food and water security, ...
He's an expert, if you can't tell.
It's 18 books, but it's just one book, but don't tell anybody. My job as a sociologist has been connecting the dots with justice, fairness, and equity being the central glue that will hold all those volumes together. When we talk about environment, climate, energy, health, we need to be cognizant of the fact that over the years, we've had technology, we've had advances that have been made, benefits, opportunities that oftentimes those benefits and opportunity are dispersed, whereas the costs are localized. Those who live closest to where the externalities are created oftentimes receive fewer of the benefits. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand this. If you live across the fence from a refinery, LNG export terminal, a chemical plant, plastics plant, or whatever that facility is, living across the fence, living closest to it, does not give you an automatic right to or an opportunity to those benefits of jobs, economic development, or other kinds of opportunities. So what we're talking about is an issue of equity and justice. In a lot of my research and other research across the country, in looking at this old technology, oil and gas, without a doubt, there's overwhelming evidence that fence line communities bear the burden for the externalities in terms of what's happening if there's an explosion or if there's an accident or if there's just pollution emitted from operations. If you look at the fence line communities across Texas, across the Gulf Coast, across the United States, when we look at, for example, refineries, the communities that are closest to the facilities, say within 2 mile, 3 mile radius, that have the greatest cancer risk, for example, 50% of those residents at risk are people of color. If you look at the fence line communities across Texas, there's no relationship, or there is a relationship in terms of, and it's the inverse relationship, in terms of having an economic renaissance being created for those fence line communities. It's just not there. So when we talk about a place like Port Arthur, one of the poorest cities in the city, in the state, has one of the largest refineries in the country, but it has not brought about an economic renaissance to Port Arthur. So we have to talk about how do we ensure that as we transition to a clean energy economy, that we don't build this new economy on a flawed, unequal system when it comes to those benefits, not just for the workers, but also for business operations as well as those residents who are on the front line and fence line. So when we talk about the science, the data, the facts, my question is, as a scientist, one who value science, data, and facts, where's the National Academy of Science, Engineering, Medicine study saying that hydrogen works and is a real climate solution to in terms of where we are now? Or where is the study showing, National Academy, all three of them, that CCS works and is a reliable, scientifically validated climate solution? The same communities that are oftentimes, historically, that have borne the negative impacts of pollution, and I'll give you a fact, America is segregated and so is pollution. You look at Houston, we know where the Houston Ship Channel is located. You look at the communities that line the ship channel, these are not economically rich communities. They're disproportionately impacted in terms of the health disparities, economic inequality, and disproportionately represented by people of color. Now, what I'm saying is that if we are to proceed and move forward in warp speed, there needs to be more caution, there needs to be more data, more gathering of the facts and assembling those facts so that we do not make the same mistakes in the past of somehow pushing out risky, unproven technology for the sake of the fact that there's billions of dollars from the federal government, tax dollars now subsidizing hydrogen hubs and CCS. So as an environmental justice researcher, scholar, and one who cares about justice, fairness, and equity, and with health of vulnerable communities given top priority, I say that we need to make sure that what we move out does no harm. Because if we're basically building on inequality and going down the same path, it is not a future for anybody. And it's definitely not a future for Texas or the US or the world if we're talking about arresting and addressing climate and moving away from fossil fuels. I'll stop because you give a professor a microphone, he could go on. I won't use the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I want to start this discussion just acknowledging the big context of climate change, which is, of course, this huge problem that the whole globe is having to face. And climate change is being caused in large part because humans are burning fossil fuels, which emit greenhouse gases. And that's why we're here to talk about hydrogen and geothermal, because when you burn hydrogen in a fuel cell and when you operate geothermal, those aren't emitting greenhouse gases. But like Bob told us, there's concerns about this long legacy of environmental justice. And with each of these technologies, a lot of people are watching to make sure that those patterns don't repeat. So I want to go back to you, Brett, because when we use this term CCUS, that means carbon capture. And you can make hydrogen, like Brett said in his opening remarks, from natural gas and then capture the CO2. So that's a way that supporters of hydrogen say you can clean up the process for making it. And on the other side, there's a lot of people who just don't trust that carbon capture is going to be as clean as supporters say it will be, and so they don't believe that hydrogen made from natural gas or from methane is where federal funding should be going, where companies should be investing money. So I'd love if you could address that criticism, Brett.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not here as an advocate for any particular technology, but we have studied a lot of these technologies at the center. And Dr. Bullard, I don't know if there's a National Academy study. I'll have to go look at that. No. But there have been a number of energy, IEA and the Department of Energy have done a number of studies on the use of these technologies, whether it's what we call blue, and I don't like the colors for a reason I'll explain in a minute. But when we talk about hydrogen, people sometimes talk about the colors of hydrogen, which we use as a shorthand. So we talk about gray, which means basically hydrogen that's produced with natural gas where the CO2 isn't captured. We talk about blue, which is hydrogen with carbon capture, which you mentioned. And then we talk about green, which is hydrogen that's created by splitting water. And I won't get into pink and white and all the other different colors, but that's why but I think the through line for all these different ways of producing hydrogen is carbon intensity. And so the idea, why would we want to do this? We'd want to do it because we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we put into the atmosphere today. And so if you produce hydrogen and it's not abated, it has a lot of CO2 in it. And we can't talk about local air pollution as well. The communities that surround some of these refineries, have issues with particulate matter from diesel trucks. They have issues with nitrogen oxide and SO2. So there's a lot of different pollutants, ozone that's created. It's not just carbon that we need to focus on. It's these other local sources of pollution too. But the theory of the case for using hydrogen as a tool for decarbonization is first we want to electrify everything we can. So to the point that Sarah made, the first strategy for addressing our climate crisis is to use electrification. And when we mean electrification, what we really mean is using renewable energy as a source of that electrification. Because if we're using coal, for example, or oil, we're not really solving the problem. Natural gas tends to have a lower effect on greenhouse gases, but still a substantial emitter of CO2. So when we talk about electrifying everything, we really mean using renewable energy to power our homes, our cars, and everything else. But we can't do that for everything, okay? We can't do that for aviation. Difficult to do it for things like heavy-duty trucking because the batteries are too heavy. And so there are sectors that are steel, cement, that are called hard-to-abate sectors, and that's where hydrogen comes in. So just to frame the discussion, that's why we're even talking about hydrogen, because we have to find other tools in the toolkit to decarbonize all of our existing processes if we're going to meet this target of being net zero by 2050. So that's point one. Now, why do we want to use hydrogen produced from natural gas? The reason is because we know how to produce it at scale today relatively cheaply. And I think we can do it in a way that reduces the carbon emissions at the same time. And so it's somewhat of a technology that will help us start to address this in a relatively rapid fashion if we believe that we need to be on a pathway to reducing our carbon emissions by 2030. And so it is one of those technologies that will help us scale quickly. And some of the research shows, and in fact, if you look at the emissions, and this has been studied, I'd be curious on Dr. Bullard's thoughts on this. Today we're producing, just to give a number, about 10 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen produced. And so that's a relatively high number. The benchmark that is in some of the federal legislation is 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And some of the technologies that if we are sequestering the CO2, and if we're making sure we can capture the methane that's produced, that it doesn't leak out before the process, we can get those numbers down to around that 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And so that's really why we want to use that technology, because it's a technology that helps us to address some of these hard-to-abate sectors and gets us on the path. I will tell you that there are exciting things that are coming out of the labs, and very interested in the geothermal, but in this hydrogen space. I was at A&M a couple weeks ago, and they have a very interesting technology using plasma, and there's technologies here in Houston that some of the other startups.
You're giving me more stories to report on.
Yes, no. There are really interesting, Cemvita is using synthetic biology to produce hydrogen. And so there's all these other technologies. I guess my point is, in this, we're not just limited to the technologies that are existing today. If we start down this pathway, we're going to start to see other things come to fruition in a relatively short period of time that we can't even imagine today.
Right.
And so that's the reason we need to get started, and why we need to start with what we have and then improve it over time. That's what I would say in terms of your question.
Thanks. Right. And it sounds like what you're saying is you do believe that carbon capture can bring those carbon emission rates down.
Yeah, I think it is it's a great conversation to have with Dr. Bullard, because it is a trust but verify sort of thing.
Yes.
If we're not making sure that we are hitting these targets, then we're not accomplishing the goal. And so this idea of thinking about ways of measuring and validating carbon intensity is really key to making this a success.
Okay. We'll get to you, Dr. Bullard. One moment. I want to bring up the challenges facing geothermal too, which are that in the past, some geothermal projects have been linked to earthquakes because, of course, you're going down into the subsurface of the earth. And some people have brought up some environmental concerns with potential water problems that my reporting didn't get into, but I wanted to raise just in case that's something, Sarah, you want to address.
Yeah, I'd love to, especially because hearing Dr. Bullard talk hits a real chord with me. I'm actually the liaison responsible for all of our community engagement and stakeholder affairs at Fervo. And I spend a lot of time in Beaver County, Utah because of that, which is a very underserved community whose biggest form of employment when we rolled into town was large hog farms that they sent to California for slaughter. These hog farms have actually now closed because of a proposition that happened in the state of California, and the community is in a pretty dire state of emergency because they have lost the single largest non-ag employer in the county. And the whole county has about 9,500 people residing in it, including children. So I think we think a lot about building a project that lasts not just for the environment, but for the communities where we work. About 60% of our staff comes from the oil and gas industry, and got a front row seat to how community engagement is not done well with fracking across the United States, myself included. I ran frack crews in Rock Springs, Wyoming. At the same time, my aunt was the legislative director for the Sierra Club in Denver, and we had some really interesting conversations about basically big oil's treatment of community feelings around fracking. And so I am a fracking expert, thankfully, and so can hold my company to really high accountability and high standards when it comes to any issues associated with fracking and water pollution. But I think we've basically taken a stance that if what we're doing impacts the community in a negative way, the accounting doesn't shake out. And I don't think that we would get into a position where we say, yes, we're causing earthquakes, and yes, we are poisoning water tables, but it's so important for the climate that we're doing what we're doing that we're going to keep going. I think the only way we think about establishing a sustainable solution that sort of leads us into our future is one that actually, yes, addresses what we're trying to solve from a climate perspective, but also from a community perspective is inclusive and sort of at worst benign rather than detrimental. So yes, two of the biggest issues for geothermal energy are one, water pollution as it relates to fracking, and two, seismicity, which is inducing earthquakes in the earth. Number two, we got to see firsthand. Recently, Fervo Energy performed its very first frack out in Beaver County. We fracked 2 wells, and we did see increased seismic activity in the area as a result of that. You can read all about it on our website. We try to be really, really open about what is happening. So the same thing that makes geothermal energy reservoirs really high quality are basically plates in the earth are sort of pulling apart that allows heat to, this is very simple, sort of rise to the surface. And so they are typically very seismically, naturally active zones, meaning that if we never came there, the community sees seismic activity all the time. And so we, for better or for worse, get to deal with a seismically active zone just by rolling into town. And so when we start pumping a bunch of water and sand into the earth, you can sort of activate some of that seismic activity. And there are established practices, established by the Department of Energy and a bunch of seismic experts, that say in the event that you're pumping a lot of high pressure water into a seismically active zone, this is how you control the impact. And this is how you control man-made fractures or man-made induced seismic events. And it's this whole very intensive stoplight procedure where if you see this activity, you have this coordinated response, and you have to have this amount of measurement on surface. You have to have this amount of third parties validating your data, so you're not the sole validator of your data. You have to have a really intensive communication system, not only within the company, but within stakeholders in the area, within the community. And so during this frac, when we were seeing increased seismic activity, which could not be felt on the surface, I was on the phone with community leaders basically all day, every day for a couple of weeks, just double checking, you all haven't seen anything, heard anything. How are your citizens feeling? How's it going over there? Have you been out to the site? What is your seismometer on the high school, at the high school campus reading, those types of things. And then we held, some pretty intensive town halls afterwards where anyone hearing rumors or picking up rumors in the community could come talk to us about what they'd heard. So it is not an operation without risks. But I think the way that Fervo views it is if we cause, a magnitude 4 earthquake that can be felt on surface and that, God forbid, destroys buildings or has negative impacts on buildings and the local community, then we've sort of lost our social license to operate, and we have lost our ability to say we're going to go proliferate this at really large scale in any proximity to communities. And so I think we see the two as incredibly closely linked at this point in time, and that's sort of how we approach it as a company trying to build a truly sustainable, well-rounded solution.
So seismicity is something you can monitor constantly as you're operating, right?
You can,
Okay.
yes.
Okay,
Is there a
thank you.
long-term effect on that? Is there a long-term effect before we get further along? Did we know that yet?
Yeah, so we have some pretty good data from long operating assets in the state of California who experienced some pretty intensive seismicity during construction, and there have not appeared to be any really long-lasting effects. In some cases, actually, when you sort of trigger some of this induced seismicity, it could actually relieve some of the pressure that the reservoir is sitting under naturally and kind of mend the seismic risk that it's under. I think what it varies, it will vary sort of geography to geography and depend on how active the seismic zone is prior to entering that area. And so, I think it'll be really monitored on a project by project basis.
We're going to try to wait for questions, if you don't mind. Just give us a little bit more time.
Thank you.
I want to let Bob respond to what both of them have said. And the question that I've been thinking about is, should companies be given a chance to prove that they can do it differently or do it better? Or are some of these technologies just so concerning that you don't think they should have that chance? So a response to both of them and maybe some thoughts on that question.
Well, I think it's important that communities that have lived with the negative impacts and externalities of some of the same companies that are now talking about, trust me, I will do the right thing when it comes to hydrogen and CCS, CCUS. Trust me, we will do the right thing. Even when they have not come to communities and seeking out what are the community's concerns, response in a way in terms of allaying their fears. The location of these potential hubs was not selected in a democratic process. Community did not vote to get these things. These were decisions that were made by applications to a federal agency, DOE, that was pushing this out as money, billions of dollars available. So this is not a democratic process, and this is not a process where the communities are saying, do we have veto power to say we don't want any more pollution on us?
And what you're talking about here is the hydrogen.
I'm
hub,
talking about
right?
hydrogen hubs, and the same places where communities are overloaded with pollution from chemical plants, oil and gas. And so if you look at the proximity of where these potential hydrogen hubs and CCUS, I mean, we're talking about, in some cases, the same communities. So where's the relief that these communities are getting? And when we're looking at climate solution, there's more than greenhouse gases and parts per million when it comes to carbon. It's also those other co-pollutants that we're talking about. While we're talking about building out these hydrogen hubs, these communities are still experiencing the pollution from the diesel trucks running through, from the accidents and explosion and shelter in place and all the other things, so that this hydrogen, this so-called new technology, is extending the life of these same fossil fuel industry, plants, etc. And so the two things really don't jive. While we're talking about moving fast and furious forward with climate solutions, these communities are still having to live with this old polluting that's still coming out and creating problems. The justice, fairness, and equity lens is not applied to where these projects are going. And I do think that, and again, our gold standard for deploying in a large scale new technology, in most cases, there are studies done, not studies funded by and sponsored by the industry, but independent studies that are done. And for us, who believe in National Academy studies that oftentimes where you get something that's not only credible, believable, but it's also backed up and enforced with resource dollars by Congress. But there's nothing like that. And I'm gonna be blunt. My name is Bob, but I'm gonna be frank. Billions of dollars have been sent out the door by DOE for these hydrogen hubs, and these sites are selected, and in many cases, communities hearing about it, reading about it in the newspaper. There are communities that are going to be not hosting these things, but things that have been given to them without their consent or whatever. There's no consent to getting a facility. There's no consent form where you say, I sign this and waive away my rights, and you can come on in and do what you got to do. Now, we did a study like this with human subjects. We'd have to file a human subjects, go through that process. But this, you don't have to do that. And we say there's something wrong with giving or pushing something into a place, a space, and a community without their consent. And it's not random. Many of the people, most of the people in this room don't have to worry about this, because people in this room don't look like the communities surrounding these facilities. That's not a jab or a slight. It's a fact. So when we talk about justice and fairness and equity and making sure that the industry come under some type of overarching framework, not to make the mistake that they made in the past when communities are inundated. I did a study in 1979, 44 years ago, looking at pollution and race in Houston. It was looking at waste. But if you can extrapolate the same thing from waste sites to cement crushing plants, to polluting chemical plants, to explosions, accidents across the Gulf Coast, and if you look inside of Texas, it's the same process reproducing itself. And what I'm saying is I want this this emergency alarm to go off. Let's not allow history to repeat itself, so that we have smart people who can come up with real climate solutions, not false solutions.
So I think what I hear you saying is that maybe there is a world in which hydrogen could be good, but you want to see the proof of that first.
I want to see the proof, and I want to see more of it dealing with the color, with using renewables. But if I'm not mistaken, a lot of them are saying, well, we're going to use natural gas. Well, we were talking about moving away from methane. We call it natural gas. And we know methane is a powerful greenhouse gas pollutant. So when we talk about continuing to use this unnatural gas or natural gas, I'm going to be anyway, natural gas in the process of a climate solution, we're extending out the use of fossil fuels as opposed to moving away. I mean, it's contradictory.
And so everybody knows these hydrogen hubs that we're talking about. The Federal Department of Energy has offered up to $7 billion for a number of projects. And there was a Gulf Coast group of companies that came together and applied for this money and has been awarded up to $1.2 billion. So because we're the Texas Tribune and because we're here in Houston, I do want to get quickly to this issue of how Texas is playing a role in all three of these technologies. And I think as this conversation is kind of building around, there are advantages for these companies to being in Texas, and there's reasons that these companies are headquartered here in Houston and elsewhere in Texas. but there's also this long, history that companies are having to operate within. So Brett, can you speak a little more to why, either for Houston or for Texas, hydrogen makes sense here, and maybe also continuing to address these criticisms and these challenges for the state and locally?
Well, again, my role here is just to more, not as an advocate, but just as kind of someone to sort of provide information. And I think, Dr. Bullard makes a lot of great points. In fact, he's been such an important advocate for this, that a lot of these things that we're talking about are now embedded within the discussion that are being had in the industry. So this whole concept, and this is kind of why I said I'm honored to be on the panel with him, this idea of environmental justice didn't exist, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, until Dr. Bullard created it. And that idea of environmental justice is now embedded within the core of the work that has to be done as part of these DOE grants. And so what I mean by that is as we put together, we were part at the center of an application that was submitted. It's called High Velocity. It is one of the 7 hubs. And I want to define what a hub is in a second. But one of the big areas of focus, in fact, one of the things that we're still trying to figure out is how do we work with these communities? How do we engage the communities in a two-way dialogue? How do we show that the benefits, because part of creating a community benefits plan is to show that 40% of the benefits will benefit those in communities where these resources might go. And so it's becoming, I think it's a different day and age. I don't think it's going to be perfect, but I think it's going to hope to start down this path of making sure that there is a more inclusive way of thinking about development, and certainly in addressing all the problems that Dr. Bullard has written about, very eloquently over the course of his career. I think one thing that's important to know is in terms of what a hydrogen hub is, let me kind of talk about that, and I can talk a little bit about what the one that we're working on is. It's not, the hub that we submitted did not have specific locations yet. We're still, the companies that are going to build, and there are 7 of them that are going to build these projects, are still in the very early stages of selecting locations. And I think one of the things that will happen as we get this process started, because we haven't been awarded the money yet, we've been selected. We were selected on October 13th at an announcement that President Biden did in Philadelphia. But we're still in the negotiation phase. And a lot of the discussion right now is how do we make these community benefit plans? How do we implement them? How do we draw in these communities where these assets might be to have these sort of discussions? And really there hasn't been any dollars flowing at all from DOE for any of these projects, at least on the hydrogen side. So we're at very early stages. I tell some people that we're not even in the first inning of the game. We're still waiting for the national anthem to be sung. And
I guess I wonder, though, why do this in Texas at all? Like, why here?
Well, the reason, because Texas, as I was trying to explain when we started, is Texas is an energy state. And we have a lot of the natural resources for this, both in terms of, remember, we spend a lot of time talking about natural gas, and it's true, natural gas is an important part of our energy mix, but renewables are a big, important part of our energy mix too. So we have this this natural endowment of energy resources. We also have sort of the intellectual capital. We have a number of energy companies that are here that know how to deal with these. As Sarah mentioned, none of these technologies are by definition, harmless. They all have to be managed carefully. And so we do have the skills and capability, the engineering talent to do it. And then I think the third sort of piece of it is we do have the physical assets here as well that have been built over time, and I acknowledge that a lot of these are in the communities that Dr. Bullard is talking about. So Texas tends to be a pretty good place for energy. It's a big part of our state economy, and the physical assets, the the resources that we have and the intellectual assets make it a good place to develop these sort of plants. So what we have to do is we have to do this in a way that makes it that minimizes the harms and maximizes the benefits. And that's the equation that we have to start to get right.
Okay, we'll move to questions in about 5 minutes, so if you guys want to be thinking. Sarah, the story we did this week looks at 3 geothermal companies that are all here in Houston. So I would love if you could also speak to why, for geothermal, it makes sense to headquarter here, and what are the reasons that Texas makes this a good place to be working on that subject?
Yeah, so we are headquartered in Houston, one, from a human capital perspective. We have a lot of people in our business who have oil and gas expertise, and a lot of them, are already located here. So when we look to hire a reservoir engineer or geologist, we will often hire them away from a job in fossil fuels. So workforce is really big for us, even though our projects right now are in the western U.S., where there's really solid heat at shallow depths. Texas could be an interesting place to do geothermal in the future. The hot resources are just a bit deeper and in the state of Texas. And then the other thing was just being near our suppliers. We are using modern rigs from Helmerich & Payne. They have a big yard and a big presence in Houston. We are using modern oil field services from every single of the big names, Schlumberger, Halliburton, Baker, Liberty, and lots of them have big presences in Houston. And so it's an easy place for us to sort of do business, have technical partnerships, and design our projects. So that's sort of why we're here. I would also add the airport makes it nice to travel to all of our very rural locations. So spend a lot of time on planes.
Sure. Okay, Bob, you get the policy question. I'm just wondering, looking forward, is there state policy that would make a difference here as these technologies move ahead? Is there federal policy that would make a difference? Just speaking in terms of this energy transition going forward, what are ways that governments could be considering, having more guardrails in place?
Well, let me answer that question by saying I've witnessed 2 signings of executive orders, presidential executive orders. 1994 with Environmental Justice Executive Order by Bill Clinton. It's February 1994, and I witnessed an executive order signed April 21st, 2023 by President Biden, Environmental Justice Executive Order. The reason why we have executive orders is because we don't have any federal legislation that would build in environmental justice, fairness, and equity into policies that we're talking about now. There's a federal initiative called Justice 40 that President Biden Harris administration has that looks at as we transition to a clean energy economy, 40% of the benefits are supposed to accrue to what he calls disadvantaged communities. This is not a law. It's not a federal mandate, but it is one of the principles that's embedded into the monies that DOE is pushing out. It doesn't mean that these are goals. It doesn't mean that as the money gets pushed out to the different states and hubs that it will somehow be one set of rules that are applied equally across the 50 states. We have 50 states in the country. We have 10 regions. All regions are not created equal. Texas is in Region 6. And Region 4 and Region 6 have been problem children when it comes to our region enforcement of not only just environmental laws, but also civil rights laws, equal protection, when it comes to addressing these whole disparities when it comes to environment. So we got 50 states and even our own state agencies that are put in place to protect the environment and public health are different. Our TCEQ is very different than some of the other state agencies outside of the South. I won't call any names, but we know they are different. And so it would be great if Texas would pass a law, the legislature would pass a law that would build in the issues around environmental justice and climate justice initiatives as we talk about transitioning, like some other states have done. California, Oregon, Washington State, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts. Now, not a single southern state has passed a law. We don't expect them to. But the idea is that communities that are suffering the fact that where you live, your zip code in your state can determine whether or not you get the kinds of safeguards that we're talking about when it comes to this transition. So if you live in a zip code in Texas where this is happening, you're more likely not to get the kinds of protection than if you lived in Connecticut, Yankee land. But we have one set of rules as it applies in terms of the equal protection, civil rights, as well as Clean Air Act. Just one law, but how it gets interpreted as it hits the ground, treated differently. The general is going to sue the federal government if put a pause on LNG export terminals. And you know it's 20 whatever attorney generals. We know what states they're from. They're from states, and I won't call any name, but there's one initial, TX. So when we talk about this, yes, all states are not created equal. So it would be great if we had states that would take the initiative on this. But Texas is not one of those states that would take the initiative on climate justice and equal protection under the law. TCEQ has told us that their permitting process, the way they enforce that. And so we're on our own, brothers and sisters. Thank you.
You know, and that has really changed the way I think about excited about some of these clean energy technologies, how much more complex and nuanced this whole. I think, for questions.
Yeah, so we have one on that side of the cameras, one on this side, so you don't need to cross. Joining us, Tribune.org. You know, what does community engagement look like? Who are some of those stakeholders that you're pulling together beyond forums like this? What else is kind of intentional about what different stakeholders in a community you want to pull together for knowledge around?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been getting fired up listening to Dr. Bullard doing actually. I actually think that Watt geothermal energy project in Beaver County, Utah. I think we benefit because the community is actually I've been really able to get our arms around, you know, who are the key stakeholders, what are the communication they represent, what are the county commissioners like, what do they care about, you know, how does the and how is that different from those working in other different non-ag has been kind of like a nice place for us to have a first project because they've been incredibly, incredibly helpful. And whenever they have feedback, they give it to me very directly and very openly. And I think that is probably a result of me building really deep, strong. So what does community engagement look like? Brett of energy grant application. And I would actually say it's a nice forcing function from the Department of Energy, but is not actually always exactly what the community needs and what the community and it focuses on Justice 40. They focus on how supplier diversity in your supply chain. They focus on a number of things like this. Do that, encouraging diversity in local job creation is not one of the key is all about, but they are really, really, really concerned with local employment and local job creation. So that's sort of number one for them. So I think going to the community and asking them, what are the things that are most important to you? Not only that, how do you like to be communicated with? And then really educating them and keeping them up to speed with what we're doing, how big it is, how much truck traffic they can expect through their town in times of increased activity. Diligent job forecasting, job creation at every single given point in the construction and operations process. Actually worked with the local community to think about their city plan and actually pretty meaningful. And so today they've actually started initiating a new community plan study for themselves that says, how do we house, if 50 new people come, how are we going to house those people? And then what are the supporting services that sort of need to be enhanced in order to help accommodate services, schools, things like that. And I think we're trying to be really good partners with them as they think about full project on. And what we have stated with them is we don't want to do anything that, causes boom and bust. And we have a farm out in Fayette County, Texas, and I think what we've seen out there is there was really wildly increased activity in the Eagle Ford Shale, and then it sort of died. And lots happened out there that is no longer useful, and I think that's what we're really trying to avoid in this local community and trying to figure out how we build with them and not leave a gaping hole if we leave in 2028 after the project is online.
Thank you. We have two lines here. If you want to ask a question, you're welcome to get in line. So I do, there's two lines here. Out of respect, ask is that you ask a question with a question mark at the end. And make sure more voices are better for the conversation, so let's get through as many questions as we can. I'm going to go ahead and start with you, sir, then we're going to alternate between microphones.
Thank you. Thank you all for hosting this event and certainly the topic, very relevant to myself, but won't belabor you with why. But most of my questions, and very familiar with both of kind of the energy component. So for Dr. Bullard, really a more general concept. I lived in Galena Park for about 10 years. My parents grew up there, so I've seen those communities. I've seen some of the benefits with new schools and things like that do take place or come with some of these, facilities and industries being co-located with neighborhoods. But there is this concept of like NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. Some communities can certainly advocate for themselves more than we see that right now with 45, same thing with refineries, right? And ag, like Sarah mentioned, taking place in Beaver County. So just curious what some of your thoughts are. I mean, taking a poll of all the community, who's going to vote, but I mean, at the end of the day, maybe everybody will say, hey, I don't want a facility in my backyard. So how do we go about, or what are some of your ideas in terms of, how does industry, kind of develop within these urban environments and and what are better ways to kind of go about that than others. Sarah maybe touched on some of those with kind of this community action plan, but really particularly interested in your thoughts based on your comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I don't propose to speak for Galena Park, Manchester, or Clinton Park, Pleasantville, any of those communities. They have great leaders who speak for themselves. The first principle of environmental justice is that the people who are most impacted and who could best benefit from certain types of operations should be in the room when decisions are being made. And they need to be consulted when major decisions like these projects are being talked about, not after the fact, not after the grant is being awarded and not doing the project in the bullseye. But oftentimes that's not the way it's done. And what we're saying is change the dynamics in which decisions are being made during that process so that people can speak for themselves and be in those rooms when decisions are being made and have the information in a timely manner. Burden, the prospects as well as the promise. Oftentimes the promise exceeds the delivery. And that's not rocket science. So we have great ways of communities that now are empowered to speak for themselves because of the work that we have doing. We have built a movement. So when individuals say we don't know how to get to the community, we don't know how to of engaging, not parachuting in, but going through a rigorous process of engaging communities in a respectful way. And when you do that, people can tell you with a great deal of specificity whether or not they want this or see this as a Justice 40 benefit, a community benefits agreement, or whether it's poison pill laced with sugar. It might taste sweet, but it'll still kill you. Giving all the facts and the science and the data, and the communities have that. And it's their right to accept, to say, we want this, and it's their right also to say, we do not want any more of this dumped on. Are not respected, I'm not just talking about Texas, but across the board, because of power, money, and what's driving it. It's the money that's driving it now.
Hi, thank you so much to all of you. My name is Catherine Sorrell, and I'm an attorney, with a boutique law firm called Cultural Heritage Partners. We process for many infrastructure projects. So much of what you said is incredibly relevant. A lot of times natural resources are also cultural resources, so we're working at that intersection too. Just to piggyback off of some of what was just said, I wanted to ask a two-part question. One is, what is the difference between sort of just community engagement and then obtaining consent? So again, back to that sort of difference between a stakeholder versus a rights holder on these projects. And then also engaging communities well. So we often see it in our work, for example, in Dakota Access. Some of the investors who invested in the Dakota Access project lost billions of dollars because they didn't get consent from the community or engage those communities well. So where are you all seeing the costs, in whether it's project delays or other types of costs on these projects when, sorry, I have a cold, when this is not done well? Thank you.
Maybe, Bob, you want to start with that, and we'll let Sarah and Brett follow.
Yes. Your answer is right in terms of can be very devastating to communities if applied in a way that somehow not only destroys the cultural assets, but also destroys in terms of the social as well as the built environment. And we could talk about a lot of different projects, et cetera, that have displaced communities, and all you see now are foundations where community used to be. There's a huge difference between right now, as you apply it to the local level and going all the way up to COP meetings, the climate conferences and summits where nation states are saying we have a country, the country and the communities within that country have a right to refusal in terms government to government saying it's okay and the industry bring it. We have to understand that there has been a lot of devastation not allowing the voices in those communities to rise to the top of saying, do it differently. Do it as if your grandmother lived next door, but we know they don't. Or do it like if it's in Holland, as opposed to the Netherlands, as opposed to Convent, Louisiana, and Norco, and the Houston Ship Channel. We know they do it differently when the people are different. To clean, sustainable, healthy, to be healthy and be climate resilient. Change and climate crisis, so we have to be even more careful because climate change will exacerbate existing inequalities, and those communities are already overburdened and are more vulnerable. Climate change will make. So we can't be counting on trust me. No, we can't do that.
Sarah and Brett, do either of you want to speak quickly to the question of the cost? And a couple more questions too, if we can.
Yeah, I think the short of it, I think, you know, I'm sitting here thinking about the differences between our project and perhaps a community are the county commissioners. And so I think that that's a really interesting connect that in some ways makes it a little easier on us because they actually don't approve of something that we are doing. They can have incredible power in stopping really nice tie in this way because the incentives are really aligned.
I think the ultimate objective here is to have these discussions and to get that within a enforceable agreement that's called a community benefits agreement. So that's the objective. I think we're at the very early stages of this process, but that's where we're headed. And I think time will tell whether that's something we can actually together. And so I'm hopeful that that's where we're headed in this discussion, that we create these kind of forums for like you're doing today, where we have this dialogue back and forth, and then we understand what the issues are. We try to find ways to collectively address those issues, and then to reflection of what the community wants. And so I think that's where we're trying to head.
I just want to to give a few more people time to ask questions, but I want to make sure our speakers are okay going for about 5 more minutes. Question.
Okay, this is a soft question, and it's a short one. Brett, this is for you. In your opening remarks, did I understand 70% of the power produced on the Texas grid is solar and wind?
No, what I said is there was at one point in time in an hour that we hit that mark where we were producing 70% of our. That's an aspiration for how now can we get to that. So yes, in that peak hour where we've produced more solar and wind, we were operating the grid on high amounts of solar and wind. In California, I was just in California. We're not doing that around the clock, but that's kind of where we're headed. I'm just trying to give you a vision of where we're trying to go.
Hi, my name is Paige Powell. I'm a policy manager at Commission Shift, and I wanted to speak to some things that you said earlier. to decarbonize right here, and I really wanted to come in onto this like consent and community benefits thing, but everybody already kind of brought to the next thing. They're totally different. They're two very different things. Like free, prior, and informed consent is not the same. My 15 policy points for responsible carbon management, which you can find on our Commission Shift website. But I just would like to ask you, Mr. Pullman, if you, it seems like if we're really committed to decarbonizing, like, we need to find out if CCS and hydrogen are actual climate solutions. And Dr. Bullard said, like, let's get the academies to run a study. And my question to you is, would you be willing to take this back to your board or your associations? I know there are couple of different ones, right? You got with a lot of power and influence who might be able to restructure the process. Because as Dr. Bullard pointed out, this is not democratic, and the consent has organization do to renegotiate with DOE how we move forward, if at all, with the funding and projects.
Yeah. Again, our role here is just as basically to inform. We're not, we don't really, we're a nonprofit. Our authority to change any of these processes, but we're here, we're basically here to be part of the discussion. And I know that Commission Shift is an organization that's been very involved in issues around regulatory issues around natural gas. We're obviously very interested in those kind of discussions. But our job here is not as a it's here just to be part of a perspectives are, but I don't really have any particular authority in any of this to on sort of some of the things that you were discussing. We're simply here as a as an organization to help work on furthering the dialogue.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Doug Peterson. I'm with the Sierra Club Political Committee for the state of Texas, and also served Adrian Garcia, Commissioner to Precinct 2 for the Clear Lake area. And I can tell you that there are a lot of allies for Dr. Bullard being created all up and down the Bay Area. That is certainly 225 down 146, and all those communities in density. But my question is, as I've looked at this, it appears to me TCEQ is weak on budget or desire to enforce. That's one thing, but they continue to support permit after permit after permit. And the intensity, or rather the concentration of new infrastructure in the Bay Area is incredible. And TCEQ seems to be enforcing regulations out of what? The 1940s? We got all this concentration. So my question is, what can we do to impact that? I don't know, Dr. Bullard, maybe you have some ideas, because there are a lot of people that are crying at night because of all the pollution coming their way.
I don't have a silver bullet, but and there's a lot of that at TCEQ. They never met a permit they didn't like, and that's the problem. And I think we have to get more and more people aware, speaking out to say something must change. And again, there's a level of pollution at which I think the region and the body can bear. And I don't know what the threshold is, but you're right. There are a lot of people who are saying we need to move fast and furious to a clean energy transition quicker, fast and furious. That's that's been my reaction, and I'm a lifetime Sierra Club member.
So with,
As a matter of fact, their Environmental Justice Award is named after me. Thank you
with-
for your question.
Apologies for the gentleman on the other side of the cameras there. We need to wrap up. We have one more question here, but I know some will stay after for other questions that need to be asked with some of our speakers. So,
Hello, I'm Kristen Foster, and I am a graduate from Houston Tillotson College, and I wanted to say that voting is going to make the difference. We need to vote all the way up and down the ballot in every state, and we need to educate the public. Have more meetings like this would make a dramatic difference. And I wanted to thank Dr. Bullard for coming and sharing and inspiring the next generation of environmentalists. It's going to save lives in America, and we can work, and the future is bright. We are changing things, so thank God for you.
Yes.
You got off without a question. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, if we can give a round of applause to our panelists.